I do an intro.
Yep, I'll just show now. Welcome everyone to this Open Group webinar, which today is about best practices in graphical EA modelling. This is one of a series of events during which we are aiming to deliver some real practical advice on enterprise architecture and the use of TOGAF. And we're very pleased today that Orbis Software is presenting for us in this event. If you have any suggestions for future events, we would really welcome some ideas. Have the opportunity to list those at the end of event survey when this webinar is at a close. Before I hand over to our speaker today, who is Peter Harrod of Orbis Software, I'd just like to cover a few of the housekeeping issues. We do encourage you to ask questions during these events. This is one of the objectives of these events. The best way to submit a question is to use the text QA facility on the right of the screen. If you do submit a question, please could you address your questions to all? That way everyone gets to see the questions being asked. We'll try and answer as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the event. May also be interested to note this event is being recorded. So if for a reason you have to leave it early or you experience any local technical problems, you have the opportunity to revisit this whole event in its entirety from tomorrow. All attendees will get an email with a link to where you can access that recording. I have a request for a copy of Peter's presentation. I'd suggest you actually contact him directly, and I'm sure he will be able to sort you out with a copy of the slides. Without further ado, Peter, if you're ready, can I hand over to you to start your presentation?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Everyone, am I coming through okay?
Yeah, sounds good, Peter.
Okay, so thank you, Simon, for allowing me to present this webinar. Let's start with some introductions. I'm Harrod. I'm a senior consultant with Orbis Software. They're a vendor of the iServer product, which is a modeling software that's based around Visio. So let's start off by explaining how we come to do this webinar. Which is that being based on Visio, we're very flexible and very visual in our representation. But unfortunately, this means that we do get put on the spot very much. Because ask us, okay then, can you come up with some recommendations for how we should draw our diagrams? Having done this enough, we felt it was worth trying to codify some of the advice that we've given over the past few years, experiences that we've had in talking to our customers, and practices that we've evolved through hundreds of customers that we've dealt with, hundreds of customers and also prospects. So during the webinar, we'll start by outlining some general principles. Mind works for a good diagram. Things to mind when you're drawing a diagram, particularly from the perspective of communicating the enterprise architecture space. We'll then go on to consider standard kind of diagrams that you could use to convey a particular message. We'll go on with a couple of good examples of what not to do. And then we'll cover some conclusions and open up for discussion. Let's start with considering some of the general principles that we need to bear in mind when drawing our diagrams. Principles which apply no matter what kind of message you're trying to get across, and what your audience is, to what less sophistication you are at your EA. Next important principle of all is simply to consider do this diagram and who are you doing it for. I've found that this looks kind of similar to the Zachman framework, and to a large extent it's true. We built the old Kipling poem, 6 honest serving men, they told me all I knew, their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. People call them the 6 W's. fully valid as they are now, as they were when Kipling wrote that poem over a century ago. Who is assuming this diagram? What rests? What are they capable of understanding? Why do they care? It is similar to the whole token into architecture concept of viewpoints, but it's in that it's not just concerning their concerns, but also how will you use it, what information you're trying to convey, and most importantly, what is the maturity of your audience. The diagram to a group of rocket scientists implies different constraints to bring it to a group of field engineers. The rocket scientists will usually look for a lot more detail and a lot more complexity, whereas the field engineers are only concerned with how it affects their job. So, above all, know the audience and consider who's this diagram going to be used by, people of understanding, what level the diagram need to be pitched at, and even care. Away from this presentation, I'd urge you to take away this message. Important principle to consider when drawing diagrams to communicate in the EA space is what are you conveying? What information that this diagram is attempting to convey? And it's important not to dilute your message. General rule of thumb works best if you have one diagram that has one message. Some of you may have come across the concept of an elevator statement. The sentence or two sentences which completely explain what a particular item is about. So an elevator statement for a company explains what that company is in business to do in one or two sentences. Elevator statement for a project, what it's achieving in one or two sentences. The principle applies just as well to an enterprise architecture diagram. A map. The elevator statement might be how we validate suppliers. A position that might be what is functional decomposition for this department. A time diagram might be timelines for our replacement program. Simon, there seems a bit of lag on these diagrams, that's all. Okay, getting a little concerned that my colleague Tim next to me wasn't getting slides coming up appropriately. My apologies. In any case, these slides are available for you for download, and we will be supplying the URL to download them afterwards. The next principle that we find is important to follow when diagramming in the EA context is make sure that it's easy to understand items, different objects that you're representing. A common way of diagramming that we see in the EA space is to use boxes. And there's reasons for doing that. Boxes are space efficient. You can positions very easily. You can show the connectors very easily. But it's very difficult for an outsider coming into your diagram first time to understand what each element is. So one is to use either to graphically show what it be, like the networking diagrams in Visio. I find a particularly good compromise, however, is to follow the Archimate pattern of you can use boxes, little icons in them distinguish what is what. In this, you can get the best of both worlds. Still keep your efficient use of space and decomposition, but most importantly, it's easy for people to tell that this shape with a house in it is some kind of other item to this with the icon in it. An important principle to consider, even though we are drawing diagrams, they will have text against them usually. So it's important that people can understand the text messages that are supplementing your diagrams. In other words, adopt naming standards. Namings for your diagrams, of course, but also the items that are on your diagram. Some standards and best practices out there. For example, an agreement that process tasks on a process should be shown by verb plus noun. Or for applications, you can show by vendor, product version. And of course, structure component you would show by host name. The important point is to identify these standards and follow them. It's the argument of form is liberating. By having a standard, the question of what to call an item, and diagrams are consistent, people can from diagram to diagram and immediately understand the message you're conveying, which makes them much more likely to use the diagram in the first place. Moving to the textual question, it's if you use white space effectively in your diagrams. Make them too cluttered, separate them out, arrange clearly. It's a question of making things visually pleasing to the eye, and while, yes, actually the substance of the diagram, of making the diagram accessible to an outsider who's not familiar with the diagram in the first place. So, use space generously, and also arrange carefully on a grid. So your users, the consumer diagrams, can have confidence, sense of what the organization of the diagram is, so they can find the information that's on there easily. Now, most architecture diagrams use lines between objects, connectors, in a sense, which show flows control, data flows, connections, different reasons to draw them. It's important to be careful about your routing. The diagram that's pulled up on the right side, it appears very much like a train marshalling yard. And in this diagram, I've actually worked to try and separate out the connectors, but it becomes difficult, for example, to trace from this task shape precisely where the connections are going. Attention to the routing of your connectors. If you can't route things so that they're clear, one way to solve that problem is that you can use coloring, or dot patterns perhaps. Depending on the notation that you're using, you may be restricted in what you can use there. For example, Beam requires you to use a solid line for a sequence flow. There's no way around that. Lies in deviation and the message flow lines have different levels of dotting, and those the notation part of the standard, they do have meaning. But where leeway, considering different patterns, and use to try and keep the lines as separate as possible. having now said to use colours, I'm going to sound a cautionary note. Be careful. Ultimately, what we've found is, especially when you're presenting to business users, but in general, a diagram has to be reasonably pleasing to the eye. If it's jarring, then what people see is the jarring colours, the message that's in the diagram, which is the object. So, use your sparingly, so beware of potential issues with colour blindness. If possible, don't use colours exclusively to convey information. In the previous example where you're routing connectors, you're restricting what patterns you can use for the connectors, so possibly using colours is your only option to distinguish the different kinds of flow. Don't rely on colour to convey information, and be mindful of colour clashes. And as BPMN, I will say there are plenty of good notations out there. Use them. The thought to each of these standards. I've heard people question that, but it is. So the notation standards that exist. You have BN, you have UL, you have SysML. We're big for the Archimate notation here at Orbis. Use them, follow them, because they do present a fair amount of IP, a fair amount of thought that's gone to thinking how to represent individual items in an intuitive manner. So all in all, these are some of the generic principles that we've found work in terms of drawing diagrams. Principles, if for violating them you can easily express, then by all means, principles we found that are useful to follow and be aware of at all times. At this point we'll move on to different kind of diagrams, patterns of how to diagram things that we've worked when working with our customers. A pattern that you've used in enterprise architecture is what I'm choosing to call the catalog. It's items, possible in grouping. Familiar with the federal enterprise architecture framework? Well, familiar with CRM, the Common Reference Model. It lists various reference elements. These business elements see for us. And we find a good way to represent these kind of catalogs is by, as you boxes on top of boxes, group together. Grouping is important if you can find a wild grouping. This pattern we find commonly used is a hierarchy, showing us to child and then children. And we find two ways of doing this that work, depending on the audience, depending on the scenario. The first way uses lines, like an org chart, but it doesn't have to be top-down. So I'm just looking for the option to catch up to my slide here. Okay, yeah. we go. As you can see, a hierarchy of boxes showing decompositions of children. This approach for a hierarchy is it's very clear. It tends up space quite a lot. So in scenarios where you have a large amount of information that you fit into a small space, you go with what I've called the type 2 hierarchy, boxes on top of boxes. I'll just for the presentation to catch up to my slide here. I'm not sure to be having some latency issues on the WebEx. So the idea of this type 2 hierarchy is so a tall containing box for this level, for the highest level of the hierarchy, then a sub-box, the children, and then sub-boxes for the grandchildren. The example I've called up is process hierarchy. So top-level process, sub-process, and then sub-process. But the applies for any kind of hierarchy. The next one that I'm going to consider is the context diagram. The context diagram is to take one particular item, let's say an SAP system, or it was, say, an airline, it could be your reservation system, one key element of your architecture, which is at the center, and then show the connected into them. This is a very useful way of showing how important a particular system is, the level of dependency that other elements of the architecture have on that system, effectively the crown jewels. But one thing to be wary of when creating a diagram like this is don't take it too far. Don't show processes and data elements and servers and functions and org units. You risk using people. So, on. One pattern that in some ways is not really a diagramming pattern so much as an interaction pattern is what we call the sitemap. And that have a diagram which is explicitly intended as an entry point. I've called it a sitemap. So a sitemap diagram is one that has various elements on it. These elements are acting as a link to other bits of information. They could be terms, they could be documents. By creating a single entry point diagram, a top-level view, use some kind of software that supports linking. Most modeling tools will let you do that. You can by hand in Visio. Provide a single place for people to go in and explore your architecture. Enabling them to work offline, enabling them to get a sense of the context of the different diagrams that you've created. Now, earlier I referenced the idea of color, being with color. Color is useful, and in particular it's useful for a kind of diagram that we refer to internally in Orbis as a heat map. And that's shade different diagrams based on underlying information. Here I pulled up a process map based on the maturity of the process, or say a KPI status of the process, you might color them green, amber, and red. But as earlier, an important to bear in mind when you're using color is beware of colorblind issues. The more public your animation and your diagrams are, obviously, the more important those are. But to the Western world, there is legislation. We've got the Disability Discrimination Act. In the States, they have Section 508. There's other laws in other jurisdictions. Workaround to that scenario is use apps, representation by color. But we've also chosen icons. So red status processes have a little X icon against them. Our status processes have an exclamation mark against them. Our growth processes have a X against them. So we'll into your heat mapping, your color diagrams, icons, and of course, as I say, using too many colors or colors that jar. It sounds trivial, it sounds almost whimsical, but people pushed back by psychedelic diagrams. Now the last pattern that I'll consider is timeline. And I need to show relative durations of items, particularly in a project planning sense or in an application portfolio management sense, showing retirements, handovers. I'm showing the application portfolio management timeline diagram that we use internally, because we supplement the relative durations with arrows showing the handovers, the decommissionings, and so on. But the point about this diagram is that you immediately get a sense of when things start and when they end, and importantly, the level of overlap. So you can see that the level of overlap between the second red application and the application that supplements it. A variety of different patterns that we've found useful in conveying different parts of information. At this point, I'm going to move on to considering what we refer to as the anti-patterns, things that we would strongly recommend that you don't do. Now, the first anti-pattern that I'm going to consider is what we call the so what diagram. With the mentions, this is a diagram that attempts to show absolutely every single aspect of a particular scenario. The thing being that it's useful to have a single heads-up view of involved. But the problem with a diagram like this is that they're so cluttered and so complex, it's impossible to figure out where to start. Actual diagram that has been held up in web forums as a perfect example of what not to do. Some of you even recognize it. It's pissing me off. Okay. The other pattern that I'm going to consider is when you simply get diagrams that are too large. The meta diagram. Against intentions, if you're trying to show every aspect of a situation, you show every level. And yes, you've managed every level, but where do we get started? It's important to figure out where to drill down from. If we're pushback. So very much try and avoid creating these huge diagrams where There's too much information on there for people to get a handle on it. This is a famous diagram on the web. It attempts to show the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. And there's no better comment on the problem of using a mega diagram like this and the reaction of the first recipient of it. On that slide, we will have won the war. So before on to opening the floor to questions and discussions, I want to recommend a couple of excellent resources for anyone who is interested in best practice for conveying information. Of the napkin, I would hope that a large number of the attendees would be at least of this book. I don't recommend it too strongly. He presents the concepts that I have in a lot more detail. He presents a framework for how to decide precisely what to show on a given diagram. Focus is not on EA. It's a bit generic, very much aimed at almost pen and paper diagrams, but it's very, very informative, very useful, and I say, recommended. I also recommend Presentation Zen by Garl Reynolds. Talk in depth about good ways to do presentations, so it's focused primarily on PowerPoints and presentations, but the principles are equally valid for any kind of way of showing information visually. So at this point, I'm going to open up the floor to questions and discussion. We've been, if there's a place that you can download this presentation from, we are making it available on the Orbis software website. As Simon has said, the recording of this webinar will be available on the Open Group website. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Simon and the questions and answers.
Many, Peter, a very valuable presentation there. As I said at the beginning of this event, I think these are providing some very worthwhile tips and about how people can really help them during their day-to-day activities. And you have quite a few questions on the QA facilities. What I'll do is I'll work through them, Peter, and see if you can respond. So we'll start at the first one with Sean Duncan. Sean's asked Peter if it's accepted to reuse this presentation as an artifact in his resource repository.
We can be public domain now.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question here from Amir Nazami, and I do apologise to everyone if I'm not pronouncing your names correctly, but I'll do my best. He's asking, he said, about using some notes to convey messages along with pictorial views, Peter.
Absolutely. You have to strike a balance between text and pictures. What I'd really say is that the same considerations I've outlined for diagrams also apply for the text, which is to say, what message is this text conveying and to what audience? What should convey one message? Text having a way of writing it. So, yes, absolutely, text is important to supplement the diagrams. Just the same general principles that I've outlined would be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Robert Patton's asking, do you have any guidelines on size of diagrams and saying, for example, when printed?
Well, I recommend that you don't have your diagrams any bigger than A3 or tabloid 11 by 17 if you're in North America. Reasoning for that is, A, it's intending to hold up a huge, great piece of paper, and B, what kind of information do you have that you need to fit into such a large diagram? Say, be wary of the mega diagrams, which really the only useful thing about a diagram that it conveys how complex the situation is. That's fair enough. I would say down to A3 or 11 by 17.
Excellent. Ashok Kaushal is asking, on the context diagram, can you recommend the maximum number of entities, Peter?
Sure. Well, it's really being pulled in two directions by two different factors. Some of you are familiar with the research that the average person can only hold 7 items in their memory at one time, plus minus 2. That would be a good rule of thumb, 7 items. But of course, if you're knowing a particular framework, a collection of items, then you're going to be driven by what do you have at the top level. This diagram is a screenshot from our data set, and each one has in total 8 plus 7 is 15 elements. So there we're really driven by the ETOM standard. I think there was discussion on breaking it out into two diagrams, but we decided not to. So it's all what's navigable. I would not do more than 20, most definitely.
Okay, thank you. Slightly longer question here from Igor Lobanov. He's asking, could you elaborate a bit on what are the relevant merits of using standard, strict Archimate notation and using ad hoc box and arrow diagrams? And he goes on, would you recommend sticking to the standard whenever possible?
Yeah, I would recommend sticking to the standard. I will admit that perhaps Archimate could be improved. I mean, everything can be improved, let's face it. But Archimate is particularly good for several reasons. First of all, it's a standard that's freely available. So people come to your architecture modeling teams, even though they know where to go to download it, find it, Google it, get a bunch of resources. The open website from vendor websites and so on. In terms of the ad hoc box and arrow diagrams, the one I want to use Archimate is if there's enough of cultural fixates on object types that they're already used to. Perhaps there's some proprietary architecture framework they're using, or perhaps they really are wedded to the TOGAF content model instead. In which, fair enough. What's important, I would say, is not so much following any one particular standard as following a standard. Unless you have a particular reason to use your own one, go over what other people have spent their effort on doing. Hey, why have you embark yourself?
Great one for you, Peter. Dora Caffrey's just asking, could you just refresh us of the last book that you referred to towards the end of your presentation?
Yeah, it was Present and Zen by Guy Reynolds.
Excellent, Shay Raj asking, is there some standard perspective for different EA models?
I'm not sure I understand the question there.
Okay, if Raj is still on the line, perhaps you'd like to just send us in another question, just give us a little bit more information about what you're looking for there, please. And so we'll move on to the next one while we wait for that. Mitchell Sandling is asking, is it a principle that you should always use a legend?
I would have that as a good principle to follow. As that your audience is so familiar with the condition that you're using, it's superfluous.
A really interesting question from Luke Willett. He's referring to a very practical problem he has now, I think. He's saying the company he works for is trying to produce a as-is of our current architecture. They is said to avoid producing mega diagrams. What would you suggest is the best way to show the overall picture in one diagram?
Well, you took the mega diagram, to be perfectly honest. There are level items here: condition, conditions and belief, popular support, infrastructure services. Focus on what are the key elements. An excellent book, again, I can recommend, Enterprise Architecture as Strategy, and they consider the idea of the core diagram, which is just top-level elements. So, really, it's a case of, what are the top 5 organizational units or the top 6 market factors. My antipathy to the mega diagram and the so what diagrams is the sheer number of elements. You can't identify a smaller number of elements, then I'll argue that there's no value in doing so.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Dinesh Ain has got a question here. He's asking, can you help point to any good EA diagram templates, such as system architecture diagram, context diagram, process diagram, network diagram, and how these templates align to EA frameworks such as FEAF, DODAF and TOGAF, etc.?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll sneak in a plug for our downloads page, which has a variety of Visio templates we give away for free. But on the standards things, I can do, as I say, the Archimate notation. It's available on the Open Group website. The specification references types, but doesn't really consider the best way to draw those shapes. So those, I would go towards the principles that we talked about earlier. As I say, come on to download, steal the ideas if you want. Again, public domain, don't mind. FEAF and both prescribe particular kinds of diagrams. I don't really consider ways to some of the FEAF and DAF don't consider practices for showing how to diagram a particular point. The CIO office, I believe, does actually have recommendations for using UML to show elements. I would say, good friend, but on the side, look at Archimate standards, look at the TOGAF for mapping their viewpoints to TOGAF. That's my recommendation.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Kuldeep Dervesh is asking, do you have any guidance on using a mixture of diagramming standards to the audience? And he's just given some examples such as UML or BPMN. So using a mixture of diagramming standards to the same audience, Peter.
That's an interesting point there is that you're effectively different frameworks, because BPMN is considered focused very much at process, whereas UL is focused more on end-to-end system design. In recommendations on how you match each other, it's actually an interesting little debate that Tim and I are part of internally, our own data sets. Really look at the descriptions that each of the standards has for the different elements and see what seem to be describing the same thing. I guess there's going to be an awful lot of work done over the next few years in various forums on trying to find frameworks and by standards. Be that way, I do actually talk in some depth about how we align frameworks in our next webinar next month. I could give you a simple answer to that, but I don't think it's where the state of the industry is.
Sure, I'm sure we've got loads of questions we can't just give simple answers to, Peter, that's fine. Next question here from Sean Duncan, and he asks, do you have an opinion on lucid charts?
Sorry, lucid charts was that?
L-U-C-I-D, lucid charts.
I am not familiar with lucid charts.
Okay, that's fine. A follow-up question from Shurab Raj. Based on different EA standards, do we have defined perspectives which we need to put in a model apart from the identified ones based on the enterprise?
This was the question from Surab Raj. Based on different EA standards, do we have defined perspectives? That was the completely understanding. I suppose the question is, what does Surab understand by a perspective? Is it a collection of what you show on a particular diagram? It would be very much like a viewpoint side of the
okay.
View.
One last question here from Guy, and he said he's asked, is there any way we can find an example or an illustration of sitemap pattern implementation?
I think now, in terms of a publicly available example, do we have in our publication available on the downloads page?
Well, tomorrow.
Okay, so tomorrow there will be something available on that line via the downloads page, apparently.
Excellent. I just want to whip up that slide where you've got those links so you can remind people what those links are.
Absolutely.
That's the one, yeah. And just Shurab Raj has come back with some further clarification. He was referring to perspectives there, Peter.
Okay. A perspective then is a collection of elements that you show and a defined message that you're showing. Is my understanding of what Surab said. In which case, that's what ID 471 calls a viewpoint, and that's taken and run with by Archimate and TOGAF. The TOGAF standard and the Archimate standard, both of them available on the Open Group website. They nominate a variety of different viewpoints, they call them, not perspectives. So, yes, I would say the problem is not having defined perspectives, it's that there are two thinking at the moment on defined perspectives. And Ben and myself are working on aligning them, I believe.
Excellent. Well, that comes to the end of the questions we have. So I think, looking at the time, I think it would probably be a good idea if we close the presentation today. Just then, Peter, I'd just like to thank you again and thank all the software for leading this presentation. As I said, I think you're delivering some really valuable practical hints and tips how people can actually enhance what they're doing on a daily basis. So thank you, Peter, and hopefully all the attendees will look out for future webinars in the coming months. I know we're planning to do a few more of these kinds. So thank you very much, and I will end the presentation there. Thank you.